The west wing of Ashford Park had a reputation, not the sort spoken aloud at dinner tables or written in letters, the sort that travelled in lowered voices between housekeepers and ladies' maids, passed from one employment agency to the next like a warning folded into a reference letter. 3 footmen in 2 years, 4 chambermaids, a valet who had lasted 11 days before packing his trunk in the middle of the night and walking to the village in the rain rather than wait until morning. The agency in London had stopped sending anyone at all until Mrs. Holt, Ashford's housekeeper of 22 years, wrote them a letter that was more plea than request. The new girl arrived on a Wednesday in November, when the grounds were stripped bare and the sky sat low and pewter over the estate. Her name was Clara Ashby. She was 23, recently orphaned, and had precisely 1 letter of character from a vicar's household in Wiltshire, where she had spent the previous 4 years doing the work of 3 women without complaint. She arrived by the carrier's cart rather than the coach, because the coach cost more than she could spare, and she carried her own trunk up the servants' entrance steps without waiting to be helped. Mrs. Holt watched her from the kitchen doorway and said nothing. She had learned not to form opinions too quickly about girls sent for the West Wing. The West Wing housed His Grace, the Duke of Ashford. He was 31 years old, the last of his line, and had not left the estate in 3 years. He had not entertained guests in 2. He had dismissed his last valet with 3 words, "I require silence," and had been managing his own dressing since, which Mrs. Holt considered a personal affront to the dignity of the house, but had stopped arguing about after the 2nd year. He was not cruel. That was the thing that confused people who heard the stories and imagined a tyrant. He was not cruel. He was simply elsewhere, present in body, absent in some essential way that made the air around him feel pressurized, like the moments before a storm that never quite broke. His wife had died 3 years ago. That was all anyone said, and all anyone needed to. Clara was not assigned to the Duke directly. That was not how it worked. She was assigned to the West Wing, fires lit before 7, corridors swept, the small study aired, and the tray left outside his door at 8:30. She would not see him, Mrs. Holt explained. He did not wish to see the staff. She was to be efficient and invisible. "I understand," Clara said. The last girl, Mrs. Holt said carefully, found the silence distressing. "I grew up in a quiet house," Clara said. "I don't mind silence." Mrs. Holt studied her for a long moment. "We'll see," she said, which was the closest she came to kindness. Clara lit the fires before 6 on her first morning, because she woke early and there was nothing else to do. She swept the corridors in the grey pre-dawn light, moving carefully around the closed doors, learning the geography of the wing by feel and by the cold drafts that came through the old window frames. She assembled the breakfast tray with precision. She had been given a list of his preferences, which were few and specific, and carried it to the door of his study at exactly 8:30. She set it down. She straightened. She turned to go. Then she stopped. There was something about the door that troubled her. Not the door itself, heavy oak, old brass handle, nothing remarkable, but the sense of what was behind it. The absolute stillness. The quality of the silence that came from that room was different from the silence of empty rooms. It was inhabited silence. The silence of a person who had been awake for hours and had nothing to say. She did not know why she did it. She would not have been able to explain it if asked. She simply reached into her apron pocket, where she kept a small stub of pencil and a folded piece of paper for making inventory notes, and she wrote 4 words on the corner of the paper, tore it off, and tucked it beneath the edge of the tray. "Times good morning. Fine day." It was not a fine day. The sky was the color of old pewter, and it had begun to spit sleet against the windows. But she wrote it anyway, because it seemed to her that someone who had been alone this long might need someone to lie to them gently about the weather. She went back to the servants' hall and did not think about it again. The tray was returned at noon, as it always was, placed outside the door, with the dishes stacked neatly. The note was gone. She did not know if he had read it or simply swept it away with the napkin. She told herself it did not matter. She left a note the next morning. The sleet has stopped. There is a robin on the south-facing wall. He seems very certain of himself. The tray came back. The note was gone. She left one the morning after that and the morning after that. She did not make them long. She did not make them significant. She wrote what she saw from the corridor window while she waited for the water to heat. The quality of the light. A particular cloud formation. Once a fox that crossed the east lawn with the absolute confidence of an animal who considered the grounds his own. She wrote in the plain, direct way she thought about things, without embellishment, because she was not a woman who embellished. She had been in the West Wing for 2 weeks when she found the first response. It was tucked beneath the empty cup on the return tray, folded once. She almost missed it. She carried the tray back to the kitchen, and it was only when she was stacking the dishes that the folded paper fell onto the stone floor and she picked it up with hands that had gone inexplicably cold. She unfolded it. The robin is a trespasser. He has no claim on that wall. The wall belongs to the house. That was all. No signature. The handwriting was precise and slightly cramped, the hand of someone who had once been taught to write beautifully and had since stopped caring whether they were. Clara read it twice. Then she folded it back up and put it in her apron pocket and went about her day, and if she smiled while she was blacking the grates, there was no one there to see it. She wrote back the next morning. With respect, Your Grace, the robin was there first this morning. Possession being 9/10 of the law, I believe his claim is stronger than you suggest. The response came back the following day. You have a poor grasp of property law. She wrote, I have an excellent grasp of robins. A pause of 2 days. Then, the fox was on the east lawn again this morning. He looked at my window. She wrote, What did you do? He wrote, I looked back. She wrote, I think that was the right thing. He did not respond for 3 days after that, and she thought perhaps she had overstepped, had pushed too far into something that was not her place. She continued leaving the morning notes, the weather, the light, small observed things, but kept them lighter, less presumptuous. She told herself it did not matter. She had not been hired to matter. Then on the 4th day she found not a note beneath the cup, but a book placed on the tray beside the returned dishes. It was a slim volume, old, the spine worn to pale thread. A collection of natural observations, birds, weather patterns, the behavior of foxes. A page was marked with a strip of paper. The marked passage read, The fox, unlike the dog, does not seek approval. He observes the world and finds it adequate. There was no note. There did not need to be. She left the book outside his door the following morning with her note tucked inside the marked page. I think I understand him better now. The fox, I mean. And underneath, after a moment's consideration, Thank you. It was Mrs. Holt who noticed first, because Mrs. Holt noticed everything. She noticed that the breakfast trays were being returned with the dishes cleaner than usual, as though someone had been more deliberate about the meal. She noticed that the study fire was being built up more substantially than her instructions had specified, and that the ash each morning suggested it had burned well into the night. She noticed that Clara moved through the West Wing with a particular quality of attention, a carefulness that was not anxiety but something closer to consideration. She said nothing. She had been housekeeper at Ashford for 22 years, and she had loved the Duke since he was a boy, who used to steal biscuits from the kitchen and leave very formal written apologies on her desk afterward. She said nothing, and she watched. The notes continued through December. They grew, incrementally, longer. He wrote about the books he was reading, not summaries but arguments, things he disagreed with, questions the books raised that he had no one to ask. She answered with her own opinions, which were direct and sometimes contrary, because she had never learned to soften her thinking to suit an audience and saw no reason to start. He pushed back. She pushed back harder. He seemed, from the quality of his responses, to find this surprising. You disagree with Wordsworth entirely? He wrote. Not entirely, she wrote. I disagree with his assumption that nature requires a poet to interpret it. The robin on the wall is not waiting for someone to write about him. 3 days of silence. Then, that is either very wise or very arrogant. She wrote, possibly both. He wrote, yes, possibly both. She was carrying the morning tray down the west wing corridor on a Tuesday in the third week of December when the study door opened. She stopped. The tray was in her hands. The door was open approximately 6 inches, and in the gap stood the Duke of Ashford, in shirt sleeves, his cravat undone, his dark hair uncombed, looking at her with an expression she could not immediately name. He was taller than she had imagined. He had the kind of face that had once been arranged for charm and had since forgotten how. "You're the one leaving the notes," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, Your Grace." He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were grey, the particular grey of the sky before snow, and they held hers with an intensity that made something in her chest tighten unexpectedly. "You think the robin has a better claim on the wall than I do," he said. "I think the robin would argue so, Your Grace." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. The memory of a smile, perhaps, the shape of one, briefly recalled. "Leave the tray," he said. And he stopped. His jaw tightened slightly, as though he were negotiating with himself. "Leave a note tomorrow, as usual." "Yes, Your Grace." He closed the door. She stood in the corridor for a moment, the tray still in her hands, her heart doing something she considered entirely unreasonable. Then she set the tray down, straightened her apron, and went back to her work. She left a note the next morning. "The robin was absent today. I suspect he is making a point." He slid a response under the door while she was still in the corridor sweeping. She heard the paper move across the floorboards and stopped, broom in hand, looking at the folded square on the stone floor. She picked it up. "Perhaps he requires an apology." She laughed. It was a short, involuntary sound, quickly suppressed, but it rang in the silent corridor like something that hadn't been heard there in a very long time. She pressed her hand over her mouth. Down the hall she heard, or imagined she heard, a sound from behind the study door, something very quiet, something that might, in another life, have been a man remembering how to laugh. It was Mrs. Holt who told her, on Christmas Eve, while they were dressing the kitchen with what greenery the grounds could provide. She told her about the Duchess, not the details. Those were not hers to give, but enough. A fever, very sudden, in the January of 3 years ago. They had been married 2 years. He had loved her, Mrs. Holt said, in the careful way of someone reporting a fact rather than offering sentiment, in the way that a man loves when he has not expected to and is not prepared for it. When she died, he had simply closed, like a house shuttered against winter. He had dismissed the staff one by one, not from cruelty but from an inability to be witnessed in his grief. He had retreated into the West Wing and pulled the world in after him like a door pulled shut. "He has been alone a long time," Mrs. Holt said. "I know," Clara said. "The notes," Mrs. Holt began. "I know," Clara said again, more quietly. Mrs. Holt looked at her with the expression of a woman who had made peace with being fond of people she could not protect. "Be careful," she said finally. "Not of him. He would not hurt you. Be careful of yourself." Clara nodded. She understood what Mrs. Holt was saying, and she agreed with it entirely, and she went back to her room that night and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and told herself clearly and firmly all the reasons that careful was the right word. She was a housemaid. He was a duke. She had nothing, no family, no fortune, no position. She had a stub of pencil and a tendency to have opinions about robins. He was a man in grief, and grief made things feel like more than they were. And she was simply the first voice that had reached him in 3 years, and that was not the same as being chosen. That was proximity. That was the particular cruelty of proximity. She left a note on Christmas morning. "I hope you are not entirely alone today. I think you deserve not to be." She did not sign it differently than she ever did. She went to the servants' Christmas dinner and ate and talked and was, by all appearances, perfectly well. The response was waiting on the kitchen table when she returned, delivered by some means she didn't ask about. "I am not entirely alone. Someone keeps leaving notes." She folded it and put it with the others. She had kept all of them. She had not examined why. The new year came in cold and clear. The frost was extraordinary. The grounds transformed each morning into something that looked like a different estate entirely. Every branch and blade rendered in white, the sky above it a blue so pure it seemed almost aggressive. Clara noted it each morning in her notes. He responded with increasing frequency, sometimes the same day, the paper appearing beneath the door while she was still in the corridor. It was in the second week of January that he opened the door fully for the first time. She was in the corridor with the tray, as usual, when she heard the handle turn. She had time to straighten, to arrange her expression into something professional and calm. And then he was there, fully dressed this time, his cravat correctly tied, his hair combed, looking more like the Duke of Ashford, and less like the man in shirt sleeves who had surprised her before Christmas. He looked at her with those grey eyes, and then he looked at the tray, and then he looked at her again. "Come in," he said. She blinked. "Your Grace?" "Bring the tray in." A pause. "If you're willing." She was willing. She was, she told herself, simply doing her job. The study was not what she had imagined. She had imagined something dim and close, curtains drawn, the atmosphere of a room that had given up. Instead, it was full of morning light, the curtains open wide, the windows clean, the fire burning with the substantial warmth of a fire that had been tended carefully. Books were everywhere, not in disorder, but in the particular organized chaos of a person who was actively using them. There was a desk by the window covered in papers, and beside it a second chair that had been placed, she noticed, at an angle that suggested it had been moved recently. Moved to face the desk, moved to be beside it rather than across from it. She set the tray on the small table he indicated. She straightened. She should leave. She knew she should leave. "The frost this morning," he said from behind her. "Yes," she said. "It's remarkable. You'll write about it." "I was planning to, yes." "You could simply tell me," he said. "Now, if you wanted to." She turned to face him. He was standing by the window, looking out at the white grounds, his hands clasped behind his back with the careful stillness of a man who had learned to hold himself very still. The morning light caught the side of his face, and she could see in it both what he had been and what 3 years of grief had done. "The oak on the east side," she said after a moment. "The frost has done something extraordinary to it, every branch outlined. It looks like, I don't know, like someone drew it." He turned from the window and looked at her, not past her, not through her, not at the general space she occupied, at her. "Yes," he said quietly. "I saw it." The silence stretched between them, but it was not the pressurized silence of the corridor, the inhabited absence she had grown accustomed to. It was a different kind of silence, the kind that has something in it. "I should go," she said. "Yes," he said. He didn't move. "Clara." It was the first time he had used her name. She felt it land somewhere she wasn't prepared for. "Your Grace." "Thank you," he said. "For the notes. For—" He stopped. His jaw worked slightly. "For not being frightened of the silence." "I told Mrs. Holt I didn't mind silence," she said. "I know, she told me." The corner of his mouth shifted just slightly. "I asked her about you after the first week." She looked at him. "You asked about me?" "I was curious," he said, as though this were a simple and unremarkable thing, and perhaps for him it was, and perhaps that was the most remarkable thing of all. She left. She went back to the servants' hall, and she sat down, and she thought very carefully about what Mrs. Holt had said. "Be careful of yourself," she was trying. He began leaving the door open in the mornings, not wide, a few inches, enough that the light from his window fell in a narrow bar across the corridor floor. She would set the tray down, and he would call, from somewhere inside the room, some continuation of whatever they had last been discussing in the notes, and she would answer from the corridor, and they would have a conversation through a partially open door, like two people who had agreed on the terms of a thing without ever stating them aloud. It was, she told herself, perfectly manageable. It was less manageable when he began appearing in the corridor himself, not blocking her way, not demanding anything, simply present, walking the length of the wing in the mornings as though rediscovering the geography of his own house. He would fall into step beside her sometimes for a few minutes, while she went about her work, and they would talk about whatever they had been talking about in the notes: Wordsworth, the fox, the behavior of frost on different types of stone, and she would be acutely, unhelpfully aware of how close he was, of the specific quality of his attention, of the way he listened as though what she said was something worth the effort of hearing. She was not imagining it. She was not a woman given to imagination in that direction. She had learned early not to mistake attention for something more, because the cost of that mistake was too high and she could not afford it. But she had also learned in the same hard school to see things clearly, and what she saw clearly was that this man was not simply passing time. He was present. He was, in some way she could not yet name, beginning to come back. She was afraid of being the reason. She was more afraid of not being. It was Mrs. Holt who told her about Lord Pemberton's visit, the Duke's cousin, arriving in the 3rd week of January with a letter from the family solicitors, and, it was understood, an agenda. He was pleasant enough at dinner, Mrs. Holt said. He had the easy manners of a man accustomed to being welcomed everywhere. He had looked around the house with the careful eyes of a man taking inventory. Clara heard this in the servants' hall and felt something cold settle in her stomach that she recognized as dread and told herself was none of her business. She left her note the next morning as usual. The frost has finally broken. The grounds look like themselves again. He did not respond until the afternoon, and when he did, the note was shorter than usual. Pemberton wants me to go to London, open the house, resume the season. She held the paper for a long time, then she wrote back. What do you want? His response came before dinner. I don't know yet. That's new. She understood what he meant. She understood it precisely, and the understanding sat in her chest like something warm and dangerous that she could not entirely afford. She was in the corridor the following morning, earlier than usual, when she heard the voices from the study, the door not quite latched, sound carrying in the cold air. Lord Pemberton's voice, smooth and reasonable, making the case for London, for society, for the resumption of a life that had been suspended. And the Duke's voice, quieter, neither agreeing nor refusing, the voice of a man still deciding. Then Pemberton said, with the particular carelessness of a man who does not know he is being cruel, "The staff here have clearly gotten comfortable, James. The housemaid who leaves notes, that's not appropriate. You know that. It's the kind of thing that gets talked about." A silence. Then the Duke's voice, very quiet and very level. "Leave the housemaid out of this conversation. I'm simply saying, I heard what you were saying." A pause. "I'd like you to say something else." Clara moved away from the corridor before she could hear more. She went back to the kitchen. She sat down. She was very still for a long time. She had known. She had known from the beginning. She had told herself she knew, had rehearsed the knowing, had been careful with herself in exactly the way Mrs. Holt had advised. And still the sound of her own position stated plainly, in that smooth, reasonable voice, had done something to her chest that she had not been prepared for. She wrote no note that evening. She thought about what she would write in the morning, something light, something about the weather, something that would put them back on the safe ground of observed small things, and she could not find the words. She went to bed and lay in the dark and was honest with herself, which was the thing she had been avoiding. She cared about him. She had been caring about him since the first response, since the cramped handwriting and the argument about property law and the fox on the east lawn. She had been caring about him with increasing specificity and increasing helplessness. And she had been telling herself it was manageable, and it was not manageable, and she needed to decide what to do about that before she made a mistake she could not take back. She wrote the note in the morning. She kept it simple. "I think you should go to London if it would help you. You have been away from the world a long time." She set the tray down and turned to go. The door opened before she had taken 2 steps. He was in shirt sleeves again. He looked as though he had not slept. He looked at her with an expression she could not name, and then he said, "I heard you in the corridor yesterday." She went very still. "Not the conversation," he said quickly. "I heard you leave. I knew you were there and then you weren't." He stopped. His jaw tightened. "Did you hear what Pemberton said?" "Yes, Your Grace." "Clara." He said her name like it meant something. What he said was wrong. Not impolitic. Wrong. Do you understand the difference? "I understand what you mean," she said carefully. But he was not wrong about the facts of the situation. "The facts of the situation," he repeated, and something moved across his face, something raw and unguarded that he did not try to hide. The fact of the situation is that you are the first person in 3 years who has spoken to me as though I were still a person worth speaking to. The fact of the situation is that I have read every note you have ever left me, and I have kept them, and I would like you to know that." He stopped. His voice, when he continued, was lower. "I would like you to know that I am aware of exactly what I am asking when I ask you to stay. I am not asking you to be invisible. I am asking you to be what you are, whatever that becomes." She looked at him. Her heart was doing something entirely unreasonable, and she let it because there was nothing else to do. "That is a great deal to ask," she said. "Yes," he said, "I know. You have a cousin who thinks I'm a problem to be managed. My cousin's opinion of the situation is not a factor I intend to weight heavily. Your Grace, James," he said. "In this corridor at this hour, I would prefer James." She was quiet for a long moment. The morning light lay in its narrow bar across the floor between them. The frost was gone from the grounds, and the sky was the pale, clear blue of a world reconsidering itself. "James," she said, and the word was strange and right in equal measure. "I have been very careful not to want things I cannot have." "I know," he said. "So have I. I was not careful enough." She looked at him, this man who had shuttered himself against the world for 3 years, who had argued with her about robins through a closed door, who had asked Mrs. Holt about her after the first week and kept every folded note she had ever written. And she thought about what Mrs. Holt had said, and she thought about careful, and she thought that perhaps careful had served its purpose, and perhaps it was time to put it down. "The robin came back this morning," she said. He blinked. Then the corner of his mouth moved, and this time it did not stop at the memory of a smile. It became one, real and slightly uncertain and entirely unguarded, and it changed his face in a way that made her breath catch. "Did he?" James said. He looked very certain of himself. "As he should," James said. "He has an excellent advocate." She laughed, the same short, involuntary sound she had suppressed in the corridor before Christmas, and this time she did not press her hand over her mouth. This time she let it ring in the silent corridor, and he stood in the doorway of his study and listened to it as though it were something he had been waiting to hear for a very long time. He offered her his hand, not formally, not with ceremony, simply his hand, open, in the space between them. A question. She looked at it. She thought about every careful thing she had told herself. Then she put her hand in his. They stood in the corridor of the west wing of Ashford Park while the morning light moved across the floor, and the world outside was pale and clear and reconsidering, and neither of them said anything for a long time because there was, for once, nothing that needed saying. The staff noticed. Of course they noticed. Mrs. Holt noticed and said nothing, which was her way of saying everything. The footmen noticed and were sensible enough to keep their observations to themselves. Lord Pemberton noticed and wrote a letter to the family solicitors, which the Duke received, read, and placed in the fire with the unhurried calm of a man who had made a decision and was at peace with it. There were conversations, there were difficulties, there were people who had opinions about the housemaid from Wiltshire and the Duke of Ashford, and those people made their opinions known through the channels available to them, which were numerous and well practiced. Clara heard some of what was said and did not pretend it didn't land. James heard all of it and stood between her and as much of it as he could reach, not with drama or declaration, but with the quiet, consistent, daily fact of his choosing, which she came to understand was the most powerful thing he had. He asked her in March, in the study where the curtains were always open now, and the fire burned warmly, and the second chair had long since ceased to be remarkable, with the directness of a man who had learned, through months of folded notes, that she preferred plain truth to ceremony. She said yes with the same directness because she did. They were married in April, when the grounds were finally, unambiguously, alive. Mrs. Holt cried, which she denied afterward with great conviction. The robin on the south-facing wall was present throughout the ceremony and was observed by no fewer than 3 guests to look extremely certain of himself. 2 years later, Ashford Park was a different house. Not in its bones. The stone was the same stone, the old oak the same oak, the west wing corridor the same corridor, with the same cold draughts through the same old window frames. But the curtains were open in every room, and there were fires in wings that had been cold for years, and the sound of voices, not just the careful voices of staff going about their work, but the ordinary, unremarkable sound of people living, filled the rooms from morning until well past midnight. James found her one evening in the corridor of the west wing, where she still walked sometimes, for reasons she didn't entirely examine. She was standing at the window at the end of the hall, looking out at the east lawn in the last of the winter light. He came and stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "What are you looking at?" he asked. "The fox was on the east lawn this morning," she said. "I was thinking about writing you a note." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "We have been married 2 years." "I know. You could simply tell me." "I know that too," she said. She turned to look at him. His grey eyes, which she had been reading for 2 years and still found inexhaustible, were warm and steady and entirely unguarded. "I think I'll write the note anyway." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached up and tucked a piece of hair back from her face with the careful tenderness of a man who had learned to be present again, slowly, by degrees, beginning with a folded piece of paper left beneath an empty cup. "Tell me what you'll write," he said. She considered. "The fox was on the east lawn this morning." He looked very certain of himself. She paused. "And someone should know." "Someone does," James said quietly. "Someone always will." He kissed her there in the corridor, in the last of the winter light, while the frost was beginning to form again on the old window glass, and somewhere below them a child, their daughter, 18 months old, and already possessed of strong opinions about most things, could be heard making her views on the current state of affairs known to Mrs. Holt in the kitchen below. Mrs. Holt's response was warm and entirely indulgent, which she would also deny. The west wing of Ashford Park had a reputation still, but it was a different kind now, the kind that travelled in raised voices between housekeepers and ladies' maids, passed from one employment agency to the next like a promise folded into a letter, that the house was alive again, that the Duke had come back from wherever grief had taken him, that it had started, of all things, with a girl who left notes about the weather and argued about robins and was not frightened of silence. That sometimes the smallest, most ordinary act of reaching toward someone is the thing that reaches them. "Thank you for staying until the very end." Clara and James began with folded notes slipped beneath a breakfast tray, small, stubborn acts of presence in a house that had forgotten how to be inhabited and built from that something neither of them had believed they were allowed to want. If their story moved you, if you found yourself rooting for the girl with the pencil stub and the man who kept every note she ever wrote, consider subscribing and ringing the bell. There are more stories here, more impossible connections and hard-won choices waiting to be told. You are the reason these stories exist. Thank you for being here.